Hello, everybody, and welcome to the One Mind Dharma podcast. I apologize for taking a few weeks to get this episode up. The microphone that I used broke. It had a good life, though. It was 12 years old. Anyways, as always, just a few little house cleaning things. If you want to learn more about us, you can visit oneminddharma.com or themindfulcounselor.me. And for individual sessions, visit oneminddharma.com/coach. And of course, we are starting our monthly sitting group up in February. It's free. We're not asking for donations. It's online. All are welcome. You can visit oneminddharma.com/group to learn about that. So I realize that the sound quality may not be the same today as it usually is. I'm using Elizabeth's microphone. So just hang with me. We're waiting for a new microphone to get here. But today I wanted to move into the second foundation of mindfulness. We talked last week out of habit. We talked last time about the first foundation and establishing mindfulness of the body. And I wanted to move into the second foundation, and I can't entirely control what order podcast players grab our podcasts, but I will upload a meditation after I upload this episode, so it should be the next episode in the feed to give this an actual practice. But the second foundation of mindfulness is vedana, or feeling tone. I think right off the bat, it's important to differentiate feeling tone from feelings or emotions. We hear the word feeling and we may think of emotions or feelings, and it is just simply not that. So we have to let go of that idea in our head. The feeling tone, and I'll read from the sutta in a moment, is simply whether an experience lands as pleasant, unpleasant, or what we often call neutral. A lot of scholars actually translate the third one as neither pleasant nor unpleasant. For pragmatic purposes, we can say neutral. This is, again, not a feeling or an emotion. It's not even a liking or disliking. It's just whether something lands at our sense door as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I think the example I've given for 10 plus years now was when we used to live in Los Angeles. There was an alleyway behind our apartment where when there was traffic, the motorcycles would go through the alleyway to skip traffic for a few blocks. And sometimes I would be meditating and a big loud bike would come through, kind of echoing off the buildings. And I definitely disliked it. I definitely had some aversion to it. But it was so unpleasant to me when I was sitting there in kind of a semi-quiet meditation in a city, but sitting in meditation, and there was this loud rumbling. The moment it touched my ears and felt it in my body, it was unpleasant. It was before disliking it or craving to be free from it or anything like that. Just that primary point of contact. You can also get a sense of it when you taste something. I remember doing a mindful eating practice at Deer Park Monastery, and we were having raspberries and looking at the raspberries and then putting them in our mouth and kind of tasting them and feeling them, and then actually biting them or breaking into them. And I remember looking at the raspberry and seeing all the little hair on it and putting it in my mouth and kind of feeling that and thinking, oh, this is unpleasant. I don't think yeah, this is unpleasant. And then I bit into it. And that moment I bit into it, just, oh, that's pleasant. There it is. I like that. I want more of that. So that's what vedana is, right? Just this kind of primary feeling tone that comes with an experience at one of the sense doors. It can be a sight, it can be a taste, a smell, a sound, a thought, a physical sensation. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then the other piece that is discussed in the suttas is worldly or unworldly feeling tone. And we'll talk about what that means. But for now, we're kind of going to stick to worldly, and then I'll go into otherworldly or spiritual feeling tone in a moment. I think before I read from the sutta, I do think it's interesting to note that this was, my understanding is that it was a bit of a radical teaching at the time of the Buddha, to not shun the pleasant feelings or pleasant feeling tones. There was so much asceticism back in the Buddha's day, where people believed to achieve some enlightenment or awakening, they had to kind of starve themselves of joy or pleasantness. And this teaching on vedana and being mindful of vedana isn't teaching us there's anything wrong with the pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. It's just to bring mindfulness to it. And furthermore, in other suttas, the Buddha talks about actually cultivating other non-worldly pleasantness and joy. The sutta begins, when experiencing a pleasant feeling, he understands I experience a pleasant feeling. When experiencing a painful feeling, he understands I experience a painful feeling. When experiencing a neither pleasant nor painful feeling, he understands I experience a neither pleasant nor painful feeling. So Tanjef here is using the word painful instead of unpleasant. But pretty straightforward instructions, right? Similar to the part on working with the body. Just to know when you're experiencing something pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. When I first started practicing, I think that when I first started practicing with vedana in sitting groups, or it was introduced to me, I would say I enjoyed, or the practice brought curiosity. But one of the things, and I've talked about this before, and it's a habit of my mind, is I wanted to understand it. I wanted to analyze it. Where is feeling tone? Where is it happening? Is it inherent, or is it my reaction? What's the difference between finding something unpleasant and disliking it? I think that these questions can be useful out of meditation as far as reflection goes. But in meditation, when we practice with vedana, the practice is really to try to tune into the actual experience and identify it. The answers do come in the 12 links in Buddhism. Vedana, which are kind of the process of samsara, the process of experience. Vedana comes between contact, specifically with a sense door, and craving. So it goes contact, vedana, craving. So we may have some, contact with, we'll use physical contact as an example. We may step outside and feel kind of the warmth of the sun on our skin, right? The heat on our skin. That's the contact with the sense door of feeling. And there's the vedana, right there. Oh, it's pleasant. And then comes some craving. Ooh, I want more of this. I'm going to stay in the sun. Or maybe we step outside and it's really cold out and we don't have a jacket on and we feel the icy wind against our skin. There's that contact. The vedana, we experience it as unpleasant. And then the craving arises to be free from it, to not experience that. The craving to put a jacket on or to go back inside. The vedana isn't inherent. It doesn't stay the same, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it happens really fast without our input, without our choice necessarily. Sometimes we want to find something pleasant but just don't. Sometimes we want to find something unpleasant, or we want to dislike something but we just find it pleasant. Matsuo Basho, a Zen monk, says, "Not knowing the name of the tree, I stood in the flood of its sweet smell." Not knowing the name of the tree, I stood in the flood of its sweet smell. We can recognize the vedana and the pleasantness or unpleasantness even before reactions, before judgments, projections, before even naming things. I was sitting on retreat. I have no idea what retreat, so I won't make it up, but sitting on retreat at Spirit Rock one time. We were sitting in the meditation hall, and it was a morning meditation, and there was a bird chirping outside, making just like a song I'd never heard before. I probably have, but I never really tuned into before. And I noticed as I sat there in silence, and the bird would sing its song every couple seconds, that I found it pleasant before I even kind of processed that it was a bird. Because what happens is we have this contact, the sound reaches our ears, the vedana is there, it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then the thoughts come, oh, that's the sound of a bird. Maybe I even have a mental image of the bird, or a sense of what direction it's coming from. The vedana came before all of that. When we hear the sound of a bird chirping, we know it's a bird almost immediately. We know what direction it's coming from almost immediately. Maybe we have an image of what kind of bird it is. Vedana comes even before that. It does take, it took me at least a little bit of effort to really tap into the true vedana and separate it from whether I liked or disliked it. Sometimes we have experiences that are maybe unpleasant and we like them. Or maybe they're pleasant and we dislike them. Even neutral, for myself and a lot of people, the neutral experiences we can dislike them or grow bored with them. They're not stimulating enough. But vedana, like working with the breath or with thoughts, they're like the clouds floating across the sky, right? They come and go, they may be present for a moment, then they move on. One of the things that I found in my practice when I came to vedana practice and when I'm not connecting with it still, is you can kind of work backwards to be mindful of the feeling tone. Sometimes I notice myself in meditation maybe really tensed up, or maybe with an urge to like scratch an itch. Maybe the mind is racing about something. And when we notice these kind of craving or aversion happening, without getting too sucked up into it or too analytical, we can just take a couple steps backwards and see what happened there. If I'm having this strong urge to scratch an itch, it's because I find there's something I dislike happening. I'm craving freedom from that itch because there's an unpleasant sensation. When I find myself tense or the mind is racing, I can often think, what, did something trigger this? Where did this start? And it's maybe a thought that was very pleasant and I just dove right into it in craving and clinging. Or maybe it's a thought that was rather unpleasant, or an emotion that was rather unpleasant, and the mind kind of reacted with some anxiety or trying to figure it out. So we can use kind of the craving or aversion or the strong experiences just to work our way backwards a little bit. Of course, like anything in life, it's not as black and white as we want it to be necessarily. Things may be predominantly pleasant or predominantly unpleasant, but sometimes they're a mix. Sometimes something can be pleasant, but also have like a touch of unpleasantness to it. Again, I've had it with birds meditating. We have chachalakas here, which I had never heard before moving here. And make a very loud noise. I can't think of a similar animal that makes that bird call. I'm sure there is, but it's a really kind of, it's not necessarily a soothing bird song. And when I first moved here, I'd sit in meditation, and I would hear them, and I found it, in a sense, it was planted as pleasant because I love the sound of nature around me while I'm meditating, but also unpleasant because of the volume of it. They would sit in the trees like right over my head, and it's very loud, and they were very close. So the sound itself wasn't like abrasive, it was the volume that I found unpleasant. I think this is important when we begin practicing with vedana, to not lump everything together too hard. If I hear the sound of a motorcycle or the sound of the chachalaka and there's some quality of unpleasantness for me, that doesn't mean that I find birds unpleasant or I find motorcycles unpleasant. All it means is in that moment, that sound was landing as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I also think that one of the powerful things for me with vedana and dealing with like chronic depression my whole life, well, not my whole life, since I was a young teen, is I've come to a point where when I'm really struggling with depression, vedana helps me in the simple sense that I find that there's actually a lot of pleasant experience going on. My affect may be unpleasant or negative or apathetic while experiencing depression, but I still experience pleasant feeling tones. I may not like them in the same way. I may not have the wise energy or effort, but it's not all unpleasant. And the same goes for the other side, that when I'm content and happy, there's still unpleasant feeling tone happening. The teaching here isn't to stop unpleasant feelings or to make more pleasant feeling tones, but just to be aware of it. And then neutral, which you may have noticed I largely left out in this discussion thus far, neutral feeling tones can sometimes be the most elusive in our practice. I think as humans, as animals, we are programmed, or I don't know if that's the right word, we're hardwired, or our brains and nervous system work to give more priority to the stronger experiences, the more intense ones. It's natural for our survival. The neutral experiences are, in a sense, not a concern for our survival. A teacher at Against the Stream, George Haas, used to always say, the brain is hardwired for survival, not for happiness. And part of this training is retraining the mind in a sense. So, to really give some attention to the neutral experience. When we're sitting in meditation, one of the ways that when I'm doing vedana is maybe there's sensations in the body. For me, the feeling of the feet on the floor, the feeling of my forearms resting on my legs, how I rest my arms when I meditate, the feeling of my clothes resting on my body. A lot of those kind of physical sensations that are just there, I experience as neutral. And there's nothing necessarily to do with this, but just to really tune into like, oh, that's neutral. I experience that as neutral. It's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. One of the teachings in the commentaries is that neutral vedana can lead to ignorance or boredom. We don't tune into it, we don't pay attention to it. The mind craves more intensity, more pleasantness or unpleasantness. So make a point to also tune into the neutral experiences. I mentioned the Bodhipaksa article in the first Foundation of Mindfulness from Wild Mind, and I'll include it in the show notes again. Bodhipaksa points out that this is a dynamic process, right? We can work from the first foundation into the second. And we'll do this in the meditation, but specifically by bringing awareness to the body and the physical sensations in the body, and then tuning into the feeling tone of it. We do this through, in insight meditation, we traditionally do this through a noting practice, where you might sit in meditation and just notice what comes into your awareness. Maybe it's a sensation of the chest moving with the breath, and you would just use a one-word note, chest or breath, and then a one-word note for the vedana. Oh, I find that pleasant, a nice pleasant breath. Maybe you have some tightness in your shoulder, unpleasant. And just noting like that, whatever arises in one's experience. So we'll have a separate episode for a meditation. But I want to encourage you right now to just pause. You don't even need to close your eyes. And see if you can notice any sensations as the body breathes. The chest, the nose, the belly, maybe the shoulders are moving. And see if you can identify the physical sensation as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. If you really don't know, then you can go with neutral. And you can see, can you find something pleasant in the body? Something that has a pleasant feeling tone. For me, if I take a big, nice, deep breath, I feel a sense of pleasantness in the lungs. And seeing if you can find something unpleasant in the body. Maybe a tightness or an itch or some physical sensation. So I want to talk about the other piece of the sutta that's, in my opinion, often left out, and that's worldly versus, Tanjef calls them spiritual feelings. So I'll read from the sutta again. When experiencing a pleasant worldly feeling, he understands I experience a pleasant worldly feeling. When experiencing a pleasant spiritual feeling, he understands I experience a pleasant spiritual feeling. When experiencing a painful worldly feeling, he understands I experience a painful worldly feeling. When experiencing a painful spiritual feeling, he understands I experience a painful spiritual feeling. When experiencing a neither pleasant nor painful worldly feeling, he understands I experience a neither pleasant nor painful worldly feeling. When experiencing a neither pleasant nor painful spiritual feeling, he understands I experience a neither pleasant nor painful spiritual feeling. So, worldly versus unworldly, or worldly versus spiritual, can really be broken down into the 6 sense doors. So worldly is anything to do, any contact with the ears, like hearing, the nose and smelling, the tongue and tasting, the skin or body and touching, the eyes and seeing, or the mind and thinking. Any experience we have at one of those sense doors is worldly. Unworldly or spiritual vedana traditionally is referred to as the kind of vedana of renunciation. They're related to concentrative states in meditation. Mahasi Sayadaw gives a few examples in the Manual of Insight. As an example of pleasant unworldly feelings, he says, a meditator whose awareness is constant and uninterrupted, and whose insight knowledge is mature, experiences the arising and passing away of the 6 sense objects arising at the 6 sense doors, and understands their impermanent nature. So this kind of level of insight that comes from practice and the leaving behind the 6 sense doors, the really concentrated states, and just allowing experience to come and go, is an example of a pleasant feeling. And as an example of a unworldly, unpleasant experience, when a meditator has reached the insight knowledges beginning with knowledge of arising and passing away, they may feel disheartened, having not achieved what he or she wanted to achieve, and thinking that he or she will be unable to attain path knowledge and fruition knowledge in this lifetime. So this kind of understanding, or the word he used was disheartened, that can happen from practice. We can experience pleasantness and unpleasantness and neutrality outside of these sense doors. I can give 2 examples of my own. I sat with Thanissaro Bhikkhu Tanjef a bunch. I did like 6 weeks at his monastery, listened to a bunch of his talks and read a bunch of his books, working on practices specifically of concentration. And what I found was, as I began to actually get into more concentrative states, there was this pleasantness, this unworldly pleasantness. And not unworldly as in something supernatural, but it was a pleasantness that was distinguishable from just a thought or a feeling or an emotion. This level of calmness and clarity and watching thoughts really come and go, absolutely not hooking in, was almost relaxing in a way. It was a relief. And I would notice how pleasant it was, and I would get kind of giddy or excited in a sense, and kind of crave or cling to it, and poof, my concentration was gone. And as I experienced that more, I actually would start to sit in concentration meditation. And one of the teachings on developing concentration is that the 5 hindrances can hinder you in your progress to concentrative states. And I noticed that I was really having some desire, some craving or clinging to that pleasantness, that liking. And it was preventing me from actually concentrating because I was leaning too far into it. So I talked with my teacher at the time about it. Kevin Griffin, was telling him about it. And he said, why don't you focus on that piece of unworldly vedana? Notice, really try to tune in when you do feel that pleasantness, and kind of not necessarily stop it there, but bring mindfulness to it there, to give yourself a little bit more awareness of what's going on before you find yourself totally clinging and craving. And so that was what I did. I sat in meditation. Sometimes I fell right into craving and clinging. But when I did have that pleasantness arise, that unworldly pleasantness of having a really collected attention, I tuned into it. I recognized it and named it. And that allowed me, with time, not the first time, but with time, to not react so strongly to it. On the other hand, I had a unpleasant, unworldly experience. When I was got introduced to meditation when I was young, like a preteen, and then a teenager. And then I went off to explore drugs and alcohol as my meditation. And when I came back to meditation at 18, 19, I remember sitting in a group at Against the Stream, and Casey, don't remember his last name, who had been meditating for 20 years, said something about at some point we have the experience that this is it in meditation. That sure, we may have insights, we may have moments that really help us and support us, but at some point we realize in the practice that we're not waiting for some necessarily white light, amazing, powerful experience. That we realize just this is it, the practice, this is it. And I remember hearing it at the time and being like, yeah, hell yeah, man. For sure. And then years down the line, maybe 5 or 6 years later, I was sitting on a retreat or at a monastery, and I had that actual insight, right? We talk in insight meditation about the insights that we have. The difference between knowing something in our head, like when that young man Casey said that, I understood it intellectually. Yes, this is it. This is the practice. Versus knowing it in our bones, when we have the actual experience of this is it. This is the practice. This is how we grow. This is how we attend to the world with mindfulness. And I was sitting, I want to say it was at Deer Park, but it might have been at Wat Meta. And I had that experience of, this is it. And it lasted kind of for, in a sense, for months. It wasn't just like one moment or one experience where I sat in meditation, and frequently I had this experience of like, there's no white light coming. There's no epiphany that's just going to release me from my suffering. This is it. Just being aware of the feeling tones, being aware of how the mind works, being aware or practicing being aware, cultivating this awareness, cultivating this loving kindness and compassion, observing our experience from moment to moment. This is it. As we do this over and over again and really dedicate energy and time, we begin to see things more clearly. We naturally begin to have a little more choice in how we respond. But it was this, I think, disheartening, like Mahasi Sayadaw used, is a good word. Kind of this disheartening of like, there's no white light savior moment coming for me. And it was an unworldly, unpleasant feeling. I actually think it's a useful insight, and it supported me a lot, and kept me in the present moment rather than like looking towards something always. But it was still unpleasant and unworldly, right? It wasn't just a thought. It wasn't just a feeling in the body. It was an insight. It was like a spiritual. I've heard someone, I don't really love to see it this way, but I will repeat it just because I think it's a useful way to look at it. I've heard someone say that if the worldly feelings are at the six sense doors, right, like a thought hitting the mind or sound hitting the ears, the unworldly feelings are like an insight hitting your soul. I don't love that language for many reasons, but I think it's a really good way to put it. Or a good way to like kind of visualize it. So what's the purpose of this, or the goal of this, of course? Just like mindfulness of the body, it's to get to know experience clearly. And I've talked about this before kind of endlessly. Knowing, I sat for years before I heard this. Knowing, the word that is often used in the sutras as knowing, isn't the same word as like understanding or knowing intellectually that we use in English. There's two words in Pali, and the word that's used for knowing is actually more like experiencing or knowing firsthand. So part of this practice allows us to know experience more clearly, to know the pleasantness and unpleasantness and what it feels like. We see things more clearly. We also can kind of, and we'll talk about this as we move into the other foundations, we also can kind of choose how we respond a little bit more. As you get to know the pleasant experiences and you really tune into them, you may notice, oh, that's pleasant, and here comes the liking and the craving, and I'm just going to return to the actual pleasant experience. So we kind of get a little more power to leave the craving and clinging and aversion behind. I've had it with sensations in the body while meditating. We'll use like an itch again as an example, where I have an itch, like my face itches or something, and I notice it's unpleasant. I notice I don't like it. I want to be free from it, and I notice the intention or urge to lift my arm and scratch it. And sometimes I do very mindfully, and I feel it and tune into it. And other times I just return to the vedana. I return to the unpleasantness. I feel the sensation on my skin and return to the unpleasantness, not really giving space to the craving or clinging or aversion. Even in daily life, I've had moments as part of it's getting older or maturing, both physically or spiritually or mentally. But I've had moments where something very unpleasant happens, or relatively unpleasant, and I just say, oh man, that was really unpleasant, right? Like, I don't say, oh, I effing hate this or something, because that's not my experience anymore. My experience is that I found that very unpleasant. Um, so a little bit less charged or suffering inducing. The commentaries suggest that vedana practice can lead to detachment, right? Not getting so hooked in to a sound or a thought or a feeling. Pema Chodron calls it shempa, this hooking in that happens. In vedana practice, I very much found this to be true. That as we practice vedana, it can prevent, it can support us in not getting as hooked in. We don't go kind of on autopilot through those processes. We don't have the contact, the vedana, the liking or disliking, and the clinging. Everything moves a little bit more slowly when we're paying attention. And as we talk about the 4 establishments of mindfulness, it's a huge part of experience for us to not be aware of. The same way with the body, right? The body is a huge part of our experience. It offers a ton of opportunity for us to practice. Same with vedana. It's happening all the time. It influences so much of our experience and behavior. A huge opportunity. And then the last part of the sutta, and then I will be done, is the refrain. And again, I know this language, a lot of it says he, or even he or she. I know it's not inclusive. I'm reading the translation of these scholars, but I do recognize that. He lives contemplating feelings, or vedana, in feelings internally, or he lives contemplating feeling in feelings externally, or he lives contemplating feeling in feelings internally and externally. He lives contemplating origination things in feelings, and he lives contemplating dissolution things in feelings. Or he lives contemplating origination and dissolution things in feelings. His mindfulness is established with the thought, feelings exist to the extent necessary just for knowledge and remembrance, and he lives independent and clings to none in the world. So this is the same refrain, that's what a refrain is, as the first one. So if you listen to the first episode, pretty much all of the same things go, right? We can tune into the feeling tone both internally and externally. We might recognize that something we say or something happening to someone else, independent of us, is landing as pleasant or unpleasant. Builds connectedness and empathy. And it's an opportunity, frankly, to practice in the same way as our own vedana. Origination and dissolution is the more kind of layperson terms are arising and passing away, or at least the terms I use. So that's just the impermanent nature of vedana. We can notice the changing nature. Just as something hits our ears, it may be unpleasant at first, and then it kind of shifts to more pleasant. Or maybe it's pleasant at first, and it sticks around too long, this noise, and we find it unpleasant. I used to tell this story I lived in Santa Monica, right on Main Street, like right near the beach, I don't know, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And now I live in like a tourist spot in Playa del Carmen. We've lived here for a while, and sometimes like during like Christmas time or Easter time, I go out into town, and maybe I'm driving to like go surf, or I'm driving to go do something fun, and I see all the people and all the tourists and all the noise, and there's like a little bit of traffic, and I'm like, oh, it's pleasant. Like, look at all the people enjoying the sunshine and enjoying uh, this beautiful place we live and enjoying the sea. And I find it pleasant. All the noise, all the families, all the smiles. And then sometimes when I'm in a rush, or I'm going to run errands, or I'm doing something less fun, maybe more serious, going to the store, and there's all the tourists out and they're crossing the street where they want because they're in vacation mode, and there's tourists driving, which driving in a foreign country has different social norms. I find it very unpleasant. The actual stimulus didn't change. I mean, it did, in that it's a different day or a different experience. But the actual stimulus is not what's really causing the vedana in this case. What's influencing the vedana is my affect, or my own experience. For me, this is an example of the impermanent nature of vedana, right? It's not fixed. Just because something was a sound or a taste or a feeling in the body was unpleasant yesterday doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be unpleasant today. And even if it is unpleasant today, it might feel a little different. Our experience of it might be a little bit different. And then the last piece of recognizing vedana exists just to the extent that it's useful. So not to get stuck in vedana and just kind of mope with the unpleasantness, or just rejoice with the pleasantness and not look at the other pieces, the craving and clinging, or the response of the mind. To notice the vedana, tune into it, and then leave it be. So that's that. I will upload a meditation hopefully after this episode. Might come out right before, because I don't want to say I can't control it as much as I don't understand why it does that. So it just is what it is. But I encourage you to practice with this. I encourage you, from my own experience, to practice with it quite a bit, actually. You might try just like a week of vedana, or do a vedana sit every couple days, a few times. It'll really support you as you move into the next foundation of mindfulness.